the Eastern Arab world. The British, the poor things, didn't have very many Anglicans to protect. They declared themselves protectors of the Druze, which is an offshoot of Ismaili Shiite Islam. And to this day, the guy outside the British embassy in Beirut is a Druze. Abdul Hamid II decided the turnabout is fair play, and that he would claim to be a caliph, which the Ottoman sultans mostly did not claim to be in any serious way. But he would claim to be a caliph, and then he would interfere with the Russian rule of Muslim Central Asia, and he would interfere with Algeria for the French, and every time they pulled this thing on him, he just turned the tables on them. In fact, the French forbade the importation of Ottoman-produced Qur'ans into Algeria because they were afraid that it would give cachet to the Sultan under whose auspices they were produced. So nobody took this very seriously in the Muslim world, in the Arab world. After the Arabi Revolt in 1882, the British sent out a parliamentary commission. They asked the Egyptians, did you rise up against your government having anything to do with the caliph? And they said, what's that? But the idea of the Ottoman Sultan being the caliph actually had some resonance in British India. The Muslims, about a quarter of the inhabitants of British India were Muslim, and they felt, put upon. They were surrounded by a Hindu majority, couldn't have a good hamburger. The British were dictating their laws, and so forth. And so the idea that there was a guy out there who would represent their religion and was powerful and so forth appealed to them. So they started what was called the Caliphate movement. And actually Gandhi got his start in politics by supporting the Muslim Caliphate movement during World War I. They were really afraid the British would abolish the Caliphate if they defeated the Ottoman Sultan. And then the Turkish Republic did abolish it. And so there's this strain in Indian Islam of nostalgia for the Abdul Hamid II and the era of the Ottoman renewed caliphate. And a group formed called Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is not exactly a terrorist group, but soft on terrorism, and is very popular among some South Asian Muslims and in London, which demands that that caliphate, the Abdul Hamid II caliphate, be restored. It was abolished by Ataturk. And they talk about countries of the Muslim world as being provinces of the caliphate. And they had an influence on bin Laden, because bin Laden talked about the vilayat of Afghanistan, province of Afghanistan, means of the caliphate. And Mullah Omar of the Taliban, called himself the commander of the faithful, which is a claim on the caliphate, and he wore the robe, a relic attributed to the Prophet Muhammad in Kandahar and so forth. So this is not new. And this is Ibrahim Samarai seems to be under the influence of South Asian fundamentalism, because in his inaugural speech, he quoted Abdullah Maududi a lot. And I think it's Hizb ut-Tahrir thinking that has caused him to go in this direction. And maybe it has some resonance for that small sectarian group and for some South Asian, like the 400 young men who came from Britain, mostly they're like Kashmiris and things, right? I think it's not Arab. I think it's, it does have kind of resonance in Iraq because it was the center of the Abbasid Caliphate and so forth, but I don't meet any Arabs or read any Arabs who take it seriously.
It's more a callback to the 1920s than it is.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, bin Laden gave a speech in which he said, we have destroyed the mightiest of their buildings. And then he said, وَأَذَقْنَا بَعْدَ مَا حَصْلَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ خِلَالَ الثَّمَانِينَ سَنَةَ الْمَاضِيَةَ. He said, we have destroyed the mightiest of their buildings and we've caused them to taste a little bit of what has befallen the Muslims in the last 80 years. This was 2004. So what befell the Muslims in the last 80 years? A lot of people in America sort of were puzzled by this speech, what was going on. Well, 1924 was the abolition of the caliphate. So this is part of al-Qaeda ideology, is to restore the caliphate and unite the Muslims. And if bin Laden thought if the Muslims were all united in one state under a caliph, then they'd be a superpower, because you'd have Saudi oil and you'd have Egyptian person power and you'd have technology and engineers, and then the Muslims couldn't be pushed around anymore. And the Europeans had very cleverly divided them up into these little tiny states like Jordan, Tunisia, and so forth. And those should be just gathered up into one big caliphate. So this Ibrahim Samarrai seems to me like a dime a dozen. I think he's just doing what everybody else in that movement is doing. But he's a narcissist, so he's putting himself forward with his Rolex and so forth. He wears a Rolex. This was a scandal, because when he came out and declared himself caliph and he gave his inaugural khutbah, it was a Rolex. So people thought it's not Puritan. The fundamentalist Muslims are like the Amish, they look to be plain.
Thank you for your talk and also for the historical context. My question is, given a lot of the anti-Islamic sentiment, especially in the Western world and everything, with DHS memos that have come out, media, treatment of Muslims by people and also by police, FBI, things like that, and even in academia, how do we challenge anti-Islamic sentiment, not only in academia, but also outside of it?
Yes, prejudice is based on stereotyping people. So when you take the behavior of one person in a group and you attribute that to the whole group, that's a form of collective guilt and collective punishment, and it's always wrong. We just have to stand up for the principle that you can't smear 1.5 billion Muslims with Ibrahim effing Samarrai. And there are, as you know, many attempts to do so, but it's not, the form of it isn't any different than prejudice in general. I mean, it's very common in societies to stereotype minorities as particularly dangerous. Wouldn't it be the majority that was dangerous? So you're afraid when you see the minority person walking behind you, you're more dangerous. I mean, it's just prejudice, and so it's being done now to the Muslims, and there's political gain for it. A lot of politics in democratic societies is unfortunately about making people afraid of some group, and then putting yourself forward as the person who would save them from them. And they used to do this with the communists. So, what were there 50,000 communists in the United States? Were we really afraid that that the great American GM and Ford were going to be taken over by communists? But Dick Nixon out here in California got his political start by trying to make Californians afraid that there were communists in their neighborhood, and that who could save you from them was Dick Nixon. He might have to burglarize you in the process, but so in my view, actually, for the people who go in for this kind of very pathological politics, the fall of the Soviet Union was really bad, because then nobody was afraid of communists. And you can't be afraid of the Chinese communists; they're running Walmart. So, so then 9/11 gave them this other possibility, which is, in my view, much worse, because scapegoating the communists was bad, and some people were actually imprisoned for thought crimes and so forth, but at least it wasn't racist. And now, Islamophobia is just racism, and to make it the keynote of American politics is a real step backwards.
Thank you for the talk, Professor Cole. My question concerns the U.S. foreign policy interest in dealing with ISIL. I mean, from a